Medellín, Colombia, December 2nd, 1993. A single radio frequency. A final conversation between a father and his son. It was the sound of an empire ending. The signal that would lead the world to its most elusive prey. At the height of his power, he was the 7th richest man on earth. But he didn't build an industry, he built a war. To some, he was a savior, a Robin Hood of the hills who built homes for the forgotten. To the world, he was a monster, a man who held a sovereign nation hostage to his ambition. The question was never if he could be stopped. The question was, what would be left of Colombia when he was? He transformed cocaine into a geopolitical weapon, a white tide that flooded the world and drowned a country in blood. The numbers are impossible. $70 million a day, $26 billion a year. He spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to hold the cash together. He owned a fleet of aircraft, a private zoo, and an army of men willing to die for his name. Nothing was off limits. Not commercial airliners, not the Supreme Court, not the lives of thousands. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. You either took his money or you took his bullet. There was no third option. To understand the fall of Pablo Escobar, we must first understand the weight of the crown he wore. He was a symptom of a systemic failure, a man who found a gap in history and filled it with terror. The money was never the goal. It was the power to make the world bow. And for a moment, it did. This is the story of the man who thought he could buy Colombia, and the high cost the world paid to prove him wrong. By the mid-80s, the Medellín Cartel wasn't just a business, it was a shadow government with its own laws, its own army, and its own definition of justice. The central conflict was a single word: extradition. To Escobar, a prison cell in the United States was the only fate worse than death. Better a grave in Colombia than a cell in America. The first to truly challenge him was Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. He exposed the cartel's influence in Parliament, pulling back the veil on the source of the king's wealth. The retaliation was swift. On April 30th, 1984, the cartel sent a message that no one, not even a minister of the state, was untouchable. Bonilla was assassinated in his car. This was the declaration of total war. The state declared a state of siege, and Escobar declared a campaign of terror. The target, anyone who dared to stand for the law. The hope of a nation rested on Luis Carlos Galán, a presidential candidate who promised to sign the extradition treaty and break the cartel's back. He was the most popular man in Colombia. August 18, 1989, Soacha. In front of thousands of supporters, the cartel's assassins struck again. Galán was dead before he reached the ground. The light of a nation was extinguished. The government's response was unprecedented. Massive raids, thousands of arrests, and the seizure of cartel properties. But Escobar's answer was even more brutal. Car bombs became the language of the streets. November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203. A bomb, hidden in a briefcase, detonated mid-flight. 107 innocent lives were lost in seconds, all to kill a single man who wasn't even on board. Days later, a truck bomb containing half a ton of dynamite leveled the DS intelligence headquarters in Bogotá. The message was clear: no one was safe, not even in the heart of the capital. The new president, Cesar Gaviria, refused to back down. He created the Search Block, an elite police unit with one mission: to find and kill Pablo Escobar. The hunt was no longer about justice, it was about survival. Pressed by the government and hunted by rivals, Escobar did the unthinkable. He offered to surrender, but on his own terms. He would go to prison, but it would be a prison of his own design. He entered La Catedral, a fortress that looked more like a resort than a penitentiary. From here, he would continue to rule his empire, safely tucked away from the world, or so he thought. The war was far from over. In fact, the most brutal chapter was only just beginning, because while the king was behind bars, his influence was still everywhere. July 22nd, 1992, the golden cage was no longer enough. Fearing a transfer to a real prison, Pablo Escobar simply walked out of La Catedral. The king was back in the wild, but the world he returned to had changed. He was no longer just a criminal, he was a liability. The United States, the Colombian government, and even his former allies wanted him gone. The hunt was no longer about arrest, it was about elimination. A new force emerged. Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, a shadowy vigilante group funded by rivals and assisted by the state, began systematically dismantling his empire, one body at a time. Alongside them was the Search Block. Armed with American technology and a singular focus, they monitored the airwaves, waiting for the king to make one final fatal mistake. For 16 months, he moved between safe houses, hidden in plain sight, but the isolation was breaking him. He needed to hear a voice, he needed to talk to his family, and they were listening. December 2nd, 1993, a day after his 44th birthday. Escobar made a call that lasted too long. The signal was triangulated. The Search Block moved in on a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellín. He tried to flee across the rooftops. The man who once ruled an empire was cornered on a clay tile roof. A brief, violent exchange of fire followed, and then silence. Pablo Escobar was dead. The king of cocaine, the man who built a war and nearly broke a nation, was gone. The photo of his body, surrounded by celebrating officers, became the defining image of an era. His death brought an end to the Medellín Cartel, but not to the trade. The war didn't end, it simply changed faces. The void he left was filled by others, quieter and more professional. Colombia still carries the scars. Thousands of families still seek justice for the loved ones lost to his ambition. His legacy is one of blood and billions, a cautionary tale of what happens when the law is sold to the highest bidder. He was a man who thought he could buy anything, but in the end he learned that no amount of silver can stop the lead when it finally finds its mark. This was the life of Pablo Escobar.